Welcome to Life Stories, where every journey is filled with unexpected twists and deep emotions. Today's story follows Samantha, a single mother faced with a life-altering decision that takes her down a path she never imagined. Sold at an auction to a powerful billionaire, Samantha must navigate a world of luxury, power, and hidden vulnerabilities. As her life intertwines with her captor, Tyler, they both discover that their hearts may hold more than they initially believed. Will they find love in the most unlikely of circumstances? Join us to find out. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to begin today's story. Samantha was a woman caught in the weight of an impossible decision. Life had led her to a place where choices seemed to shrink into shadows of desperation. She was a single mother, raising her son, Luke, in a tiny apartment on the edge of a city that never paused. The rent was overdue. The bills were piling up, each one heavier than the last. Luke's little face, innocent and full of hope, was her greatest strength and her deepest source of pain. There were nights when she tucked him into bed, her heart breaking as she heard the quiet rumble of his empty stomach. She had no answers, only the hollow weight of promises she could no longer keep. One evening, as she scrolled through endless job listings on her phone, something caught her eye, an unusual and unsettling opportunity. An auction. Women were being auctioned off, not for love, but for their companionship, their time, their bodies, their futures, all to be purchased by men with power and wealth. At first, she dismissed it, horrified by the very thought. But the reality of her situation loomed larger each day. The idea of providing a better future for Luke, even if it meant sacrificing her own dignity, pulled at her like an invisible thread. The night of the auction arrived. Samantha stood in a luxurious hall, surrounded by polished floors and golden chandeliers that seemed to mock her every breath. Women, young, middle-aged, from all walks of life, stood on display, like priceless objects for the rich men who filled the room. Samantha stood in the corner, her hands trembling as she tried to steady her nerves. She didn't belong here, but what choice did she have? The event organizer, a man in a sharp suit with a cold smile, approached her with instructions. "Remember," he said, his voice insincere. "Smile. Don't make eye contact with the guests. Keep your composure." She nodded, though she was barely aware of what was happening around her. All she could think of was Luke, her little boy who was waiting back home in the care of a kind neighbor. She had promised him she would make things better. But as she stood there, her heart felt like it was breaking into 1,000 pieces. What kind of mother would leave her child behind? Her name was called. Lot number 12. The words echoed through the room, loud and alien. Samantha's legs felt like they might give way beneath her as she stepped onto the stage. The lights were blinding, the air thick with expectation. She forced herself to walk forward, trying to keep her head held high, though every inch of her body screamed for escape. "This is Samantha," the organizer's voice boomed, a true beauty, elegant and graceful. His words, meant to praise, only made her feel more exposed, more like an object on display. The room hummed with approval, whispers of appreciation swirling around her. It was a feeling she had never imagined. She wanted to run, but she couldn't. She had no choice. From the back of the room, a voice cut through the murmurings. $1 million. The hall fell silent. Every eye turned to the man who had spoken. A figure seated in the shadows. There was something commanding about him. His presence made the air itself seem to shift. Tyler Brooks, an American magnate, was known for his wealth and discretion. He exuded an aura of power, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath as the auctioneer confirmed his bid. Tyler Brooks had just bought her. The auctioneer smiled as he declared, "Sold." The word hit Samantha like a blow to the chest. Her life, the life she had known, was no longer hers to control. Tyler Brooks stood and approached her. His gaze was intense, unreadable, and yet it made her feel both vulnerable and, oddly, safe in its steadiness. He didn't smile. He simply extended his hand, a silent demand that she follow him. In a daze, Samantha did. She had no other choice. Her fate had been sealed. Tyler led Samantha into a private room, A space that was every bit as luxurious and intimidating as the mansion itself. His wealth was evident in the polished wood furniture, the intricate rugs that lined the floor, the glass walls that overlooked perfectly manicured gardens. But the room felt cold, sterile, as though no amount of beauty could fill the emptiness inside. Samantha sat in the chair he indicated, her mind racing as Tyler walked over to a nearby table and retrieved an envelope. He handed it to her, his voice calm but firm. "Here's the contract," he said. "Read it carefully. Once you sign, we proceed." Samantha's hands trembled as she took the paper. Her heart was pounding, the words blurring before her eyes. She could hardly breathe. What had she done? What had she agreed to? As she reached the main clause, her stomach twisted. "You want me to have a child, and leave it with you?" she asked. Her voice barely a whisper. Tyler's gaze was cold, calculating, but he nodded, as though the terms were as simple as breathing. "I need an heir. Once the child is born, you'll leave, you'll be paid, you'll have your freedom." The air in the room seemed to shrink around her. Samantha could feel her heart breaking. But there was nothing she could do. The contract was more than just a piece of paper, it was a shackle. One that would bind her to a man she barely knew and a life she could never have imagined for herself. She couldn't do this. But Tyler's eyes, hard and unyielding, met hers. "You knew what you were getting into," he said, his voice low. "You have no room for regret. There's no turning back now." She stared at the paper, at the words she couldn't unsee, at the choice that was never truly hers. This wasn't about right or wrong anymore. It was about survival. For Luke, for the future she couldn't guarantee. With shaking hands, Samantha signed the contract. As the ink dried, so did her fate. Tyler placed the document back on the table, his expression unreadable. "Tomorrow, we begin the medical procedures. Rest tonight." Samantha nodded, but she felt no peace. There was only a heavy silence, a weight pressing down on her chest as she realized the choice she had made had changed her life forever. The next day, Samantha found herself whisked away from the cold, impersonal room where she had signed her fate to a world of luxury that only seemed to highlight the distance between her and the life she had known. The limousine ride to Tyler's mansion felt like a blur. The golden gates opened to reveal sprawling gardens and a mansion so grand it looked like something from a dream, an unsettling dream. Samantha had never seen anything like it. The stone walls seemed to hold secrets, the wide windows reflecting a world she wasn't a part of, a world she didn't understand. As she stepped into the mansion, Tyler's presence loomed over her. There was no warmth in his gaze, no sign of anything personal. Everything he said and did felt like it was dictated by a script he had memorized long ago. The staff, efficient and well-trained, ushered her through the corridors, leading her to a room that was soft and inviting. Yet it felt so foreign. There was no place in this house for her to feel like herself. Every corner of the mansion was meticulously designed, but it lacked the small personal touches that Samantha had once valued in her own home. She sat down in the plush chair, her mind racing, but before she could gather her thoughts, Tyler knocked on the door and entered, his sharp, cold gaze fixed on her. He informed her of the schedule ahead, more medical exams, more tests. There was no room for questions, no time for emotion. He was a man of action, one whose life had been built on pragmatism and control. And yet, something in his eyes, something beyond the surface, stirred something in Samantha. Was it a glimpse of vulnerability? Could it be that beneath the billionaire exterior, there was more to him than met the eye? Days passed, and as she adjusted to life in the mansion, Samantha couldn't ignore the small, unexpected moments. Tyler, though distant, had a manner of observing the world around him with a depth that didn't match his persona. She saw him one morning, in the garden, tending to a small plant. His movements were gentle, as though this small, fragile thing mattered deeply to him. She watched him for a moment before he noticed her, and in that brief exchange, something unspoken passed between them. He didn't need to say much. His eyes spoke more than his words ever could. "This plant belonged to my mother," he told her casually, as though the memory had simply slipped from his lips. She used to say that caring for it brought peace. For the first time since arriving, Samantha felt a pang of empathy. This man, this imposing figure who had purchased her like an object, had his own pain, his own grief, his own regrets, and in that moment, she realized that despite everything, they were more alike than she had first believed. They were both trapped by their pasts. They were both trying to make sense of lives they didn't fully understand. The conversations between them began to change after that. The formalities, the cold exchanges, began to feel less like barriers and more like something temporary. As the days wore on, Tyler allowed her more space to explore the mansion, to get used to her new surroundings. She wandered the lavish rooms, finding solace in the library where she could lose herself in books, and in the music room where, to her surprise, she found herself playing the piano late one night. Tyler had quietly entered the room, and for the first time, she heard him speak with softness. "You play well," he said, his voice low, as if hesitant. There was no condescension in his words, no mockery. It was simply a statement of truth, and it made her feel seen, even if just for a moment. They spent more time together, though it was never in any personal capacity. It was always business, always practical, but the cracks in Tyler's emotional armor were becoming more evident. The man who had seemed so distant at first, so rigid in his actions, was slowly revealing pieces of himself that were more human than she could have imagined. Samantha began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was more to him than the contract. She wasn't sure what was happening between them, but there was a growing connection. She saw it in the way he listened when she spoke, in the way his eyes softened at moments that he never let anyone see. And she began to understand that this wasn't just about the child she was carrying for him. This was about something deeper, something neither of them could fully control. It was during one of their quiet dinners, a rare moment when they sat across from each other without any pretenses, that Tyler asked her, almost out of nowhere, "Do you ever wonder how we got here?" Samantha paused, the question catching her off guard. She wasn't sure if he was asking about the contract, or if he meant something more personal. But in his gaze, there was something unexpected, a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "I think about it all the time," she admitted, her voice soft. "But I think we're both just trying to survive." Tyler nodded, a look of understanding passing between them. And in that moment, Samantha felt a crack in the wall she had built around herself. For the first time, she wasn't just a woman trapped in a contract. She was a person. And Tyler, perhaps for the first time, wasn't just a man with a business agenda. He was someone struggling with his own loneliness, his own past, just like she was. It was a small moment, but it changed everything. As the weeks passed in Tyler's mansion, Samantha began to notice a gradual shift in the atmosphere around her. The walls that had once seemed impenetrable, both the physical ones surrounding the mansion and the emotional ones between her and Tyler, began to crack. Ever so slightly. Tyler, once distant and businesslike, was slowly changing. His behavior, which had been initially cold and transactional, began to show flashes of humanity. The stern billionaire who had purchased her was now starting to exhibit small acts of kindness that made her question everything she thought she knew about him. Samantha still struggled to accept the circumstances of her life. The weight of the contract she had signed loomed over her, a constant reminder that she had given up a part of herself for money and survival. But in the midst of her inner conflict, she couldn't ignore the moments where Tyler's actions contradicted his icy exterior. There were the small gestures, like when he remembered her favorite books and had them placed on her bedside table. Or when he asked her about her childhood, genuinely wanting to understand her past. It was a stark contrast to the man who had initially treated her as little more than a means to an end. One evening, as the two of them sat by the fireplace, the silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. Tyler leaned back in his chair, eyes watching the flames dance. As he spoke in a soft, almost reflective tone, "I didn't grow up like you," he said. The words were quiet, but they were full of weight, as though they carried a burden he hadn't shared with anyone before. Samantha looked at him, surprised by the sudden vulnerability in his voice. What do you mean? My parents. They were always focused on business. On legacy. I never learned how to just be. My whole life was mapped out for me before I even knew what it meant to live. He paused for a moment, his gaze flicking toward her. And I'm not sure I ever learned how to love anyone, properly. Samantha's heart tightened. She had never expected Tyler to open up like this. Especially after everything that had happened. She had always viewed him as someone unreachable. Someone whose wealth had insulated him from the real world. But now, in the quiet of the room, she realized that Tyler, too, had been shaped by a past he could not escape. Just like her. Maybe we both need to learn. Samantha whispered, her voice soft but steady. The exchange was brief, but it marked a turning point. Tyler didn't respond, but the look in his eyes said everything. There was something changing between them. It wasn't just about the child she was carrying or the contract that bound them. There was a growing understanding, an unspoken respect, that had begun to replace the cold distance. As the days turned into weeks, Samantha noticed that Tyler started to involve her more in the day-to-day aspects of his life. He invited her to meetings. Not because he needed her there, but because he seemed to want her to be a part of his world. It was as though he was slowly letting her into his life. Into the space where he had once kept everyone at arm's length. And as he did, Samantha began to open up more as well. There were quiet dinners in the mansion's grand dining room. Moments when Tyler would glance across the table and ask her opinion on something unrelated to their situation. They would talk about books, about movies, about the world beyond the walls of the mansion. For the first time, it wasn't about the child they were expecting. It was about them, their thoughts, their ideas, their connection. One afternoon, as they sat in the garden, Tyler turned to her with a hint of hesitation. You know, he began. This arrangement was never supposed to be anything more than what it was. But he trailed off, not quite sure how to finish the sentence. Samantha raised an eyebrow. But what? He took a deep breath and looked away, his eyes lingering on the flowers blooming around them. But I've started to wonder if, maybe I was wrong. Maybe there's more to life than what I thought. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected him to question everything he had known so firmly. To consider that what he had built his life around might not be enough. We both have our regrets. Don't we? Samantha said, her voice quiet but filled with understanding. Tyler nodded slowly, a small, almost imperceptible smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. Yeah, I guess we do. And in that moment, Samantha realized that this connection, this unexpected bond between them, was something neither of them had planned for. It wasn't just about the child or the contract anymore. It was about finding something real, something human, something that might have been lost in the coldness of their respective lives but was beginning to emerge in the quiet spaces between them. For the first time, Samantha felt like she was no longer just a part of an arrangement. She was a person, and Tyler, for all his wealth and power, was beginning to see her as more than just a woman he had bought at an auction. As the months passed at Tyler's mansion, the unspoken connection between Samantha and him deepened, becoming something neither of them had anticipated. The once cold and transactional nature of their arrangement had been replaced by something more genuine. Something that defied the terms of the contract they had signed. There were moments when Tyler's eyes softened. Moments when Samantha saw the man behind the powerful billionaire. The man who was also learning, growing, and yearning for something more than just wealth and control. And as their bond evolved, so did their perspectives on life, love, and what truly mattered. But for Samantha, the journey was far from simple. Every day, she wrestled with the deep inner conflict that had plagued her since she first entered the mansion. She had come here to secure a future for Luke, to ensure that he wouldn't have to endure the same hardships she had. Yet, as the days wore on, she found herself caught between the promises she had made to her son and the undeniable changes taking place within herself. She was beginning to feel something for Tyler, something unexpected. Something that made her question everything she had believed about herself and her choices. Tyler, too, had begun to reveal a side of himself that was far from the stoic, business-driven man he had once been. His moments of vulnerability, when he spoke of his past and the emotional scars he carried, made Samantha realize that they both shared a fundamental need for understanding and connection. He had grown up in a world where duty and legacy were everything, and love was a luxury he couldn't afford. Now, he was starting to see that there was more to life than just fulfilling obligations. And that maybe, just maybe, he could allow himself to open up to something deeper. One evening, as they walked through the gardens, surrounded by the lush beauty of the mansion's grounds, Tyler stopped and turned to Samantha. There was a look in his eyes that she hadn't seen before, something soft, something vulnerable. "Samantha, I need to talk to you about something," he said, his voice low but steady. "I know what we've agreed to, what the contract says. But I can't keep pretending that this is just about business anymore." Samantha's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure what he meant, but she could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her. "I want more than this," Tyler continued, his gaze unwavering. "I want a life with you. I want us to build something together, something that isn't defined by a contract or an agreement. Something real." The air between them seemed to pause, as if the world was holding its breath. Samantha stood frozen, processing his words, her mind spinning with disbelief. Could it be that Tyler, the man who had once treated her as nothing more than a transaction, was now offering her something more? Something that wasn't bound by a piece of paper? Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. She had never imagined this outcome, never imagined that the man who had paid for her company would one day look at her and speak of a future. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw the sincerity in them, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could have a life together. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. This wasn't what I expected. I didn't expect to feel this way." Tyler reached out and took her hand in his, a gesture so simple yet so powerful. "I know, but we can't ignore what's happening between us. I don't want to lose this. Samantha, I want to make this work." In that moment, Samantha realized that their journey was just beginning. There was still a long road ahead, one filled with challenges and uncertainties. But she could see now that they were no longer bound by the past. They were building something new. Something that didn't need to be defined by their past mistakes or the contract they had signed. Over the next few days, Tyler and Samantha continued to explore the possibility of a future together. Tyler began making arrangements for the birth of their child. But this time, there was a sense of shared responsibility. They weren't just fulfilling obligations, they were creating a life together. A life that was full of promise. And when the time came, Tyler didn't just see Samantha as a woman he had bought, he saw her as his partner. The woman he wanted to spend his life with. He asked her to marry him. Not because it was expected, but because it was what he truly wanted. Samantha's heart swelled with emotion as she looked at the man who had changed so much in her eyes. She had never expected this kind of love, never thought that it would come from someone like him. But here she was, standing on the precipice of a new beginning, with a future full of hope and love. "Yes, Tyler," she said, her voice filled with certainty. "I will marry you." And as the days passed, they planned their wedding, a celebration of everything they had built together. Everything they had overcome. The mansion, which had once felt like a prison, now felt like a home. And as Samantha walked down the aisle, hand in hand with the man who had once been her captor and now was her partner, she realized that the journey they had started together was only the beginning of something beautiful. As the days went by, Samantha and Tyler's life began to take on a rhythm that was both new and comforting. The mansion that had once felt so isolating now felt like a home. Filled with laughter, warmth, and shared dreams, they had built something real together, a life that neither of them had expected, but one that they both cherished with all their hearts. Their love had blossomed in ways neither of them could have predicted. And every day brought them closer to the family they had always dreamed of. Samantha often found herself gazing at Tyler, her partner, her confidant, and the man who had shown her that even the most unexpected journeys could lead to the greatest love. She saw him not just as the billionaire who had bought her, but as the man who had fought for their future. The man who had softened and opened his heart in ways she never imagined possible. With their child now a part of their lives, everything they had once feared or doubted now seemed like a distant memory. They had faced challenges together, and they had overcome them, hand in hand, learning from each other every step of the way. As they stood together, looking out over the horizon one quiet evening, Tyler took her hand and whispered, "We've built something incredible, and I'm grateful for every moment of it." Samantha smiled, her heart full, and it's only the beginning. With love, unity, and the promise of a future they would share, they were ready to face whatever came next, together. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to stay updated on new stories from Life Stories.